the subject of regulations. We are looking at a regime of regulations that is pragmatic and that aids business and not obstructs business. Regulations are intended to be guardrails to ensure that the regulated persons and entities stay on the straight and narrow path. Hurdles will test your ability to overcome them, but that is not the object of regulations. And therefore, it's important to look at the existing body of regulations. I think it's generally agreed that in every sector that is regulated, there are far too many regulations and there are far too many changes being made at breathtaking speed. Speed is all right on the athletics field. I don't think in the area of regulations, you need to see that kind of pace in making changes. And if there are too many of them, and if they're changed too frequently, they will do no more than cause confusion to persons that want to comply with them, that want to be law-abiding citizens, whether individuals or corporates. So the first element, and like everything else, regulations have two elements, a stock element and a flow element. The first element we need to address is the stock element. We must have a regulations review authority for every authority that writes regulations. The Reserve Bank of India has done it and done it with reasonable success. They have the second edition of the RRA, which has brought out its first report. And this is an exercise to aid the taking out of what is contextually irrelevant, what has outlived its utility, what was all right at a point of time, perhaps even a knee-jerk reaction to address a specific transgression, but stayed on the statute books well past the intended date. Those have to be taken out by a process of review by a duly empowered authority. Similarly, we need to address the second element, which is the flow element of regulation. It won't help if you take out the stock and keep adding regulations at the same pace or at an even higher pace and further compound the errors that have been made by allowing too many regulations to stay around. So the flow element must be addressed, and that should be done by having an authority that previews regulations, that through a process of consultation not just looks at the content of regulation, but asks the fundamental question, do we need one more regulation to address the problem that we are seeking to address? Or will better enforcement of existing regulations adequately address the problem that is before us? That question needs to be asked and answered. And only if that answer leads you to thinking in terms of a new regulation to address an obvious gap, should you travel down that path. Otherwise, it's not worth getting started. And to do this, you must use the instrumentality of something that's talked about but not practiced, which is the regulatory impact assessment. Every regulation must be analyzed to look at what benefits it seeks to achieve, what are the costs associated with that, and whether it is a cost-effective method to go forward. We have to remember that at the end of the day, the price is paid by the ultimate beneficiary in whose name regulations are written. Every one of us in that exercise who is not intended beneficiary is a pass-through agent. The price, the bill will be picked up at the end of that transaction, and it is for him or her that we are writing regulations. Therefore, let us not eat into their resources and put in place regulations which do not do enough good to them and yet make them pay a higher price. The related issue, of course, to prevent regulations from overstaying their welcome is to have a sunset clause. You must have a sunset clause in regulations so that you are obliged to revisit it a few months before the expiry date to see whether in the present form it needs to continue, whether it needs to continue at all, or do you need to tweak it a little bit, refine it, amend it to make it relevant for the changing times, because change is something which necessitates a relook at regulations on a continuing basis. To ensure that you have a better climate of compliance, you must certainly have what is called an advanced ruling mechanism. A person willing to make an investment, willing to commit his or her funds, needs to know whether that investment, the associated decisions, are consistent with the regulations. And often there is no clarity. You don't want to encourage somebody to part with his wealth to make investments and then to realize that the regulations are talking of something else and what he or she has done is not legally correct. Therefore, you need an advanced ruling mechanism. Above all, you need to enhance the capacity that resides in regulatory organizations. Capacity building, not just in terms of numbers, not that if you have a few hundred people, you add to it incrementally or multiply the number by 2. That's not the way. It is to look at the content of the workforce that you have. Do they have the right experience, the right skill sets, the right attitude perhaps to look at the complex issues that are coming in the regulatory space on a continuing basis, and then to address them proactively. Not take time, not do it in a leisurely fashion, because clarity and continuity are important, but speed of disposal is equally important in regulations. It's also important to remember that regulations must be written in a simple language, preferably in simple sentences wherever possible. Very recently, the Supreme Court of India has, according to newspaper reports, referred back 3 cases to one high court saying that what you have written does not make sense, there is no clarity in what you have written. There are any number of regulations which tick that box of lack of clarity. And I think it is consciously required to address this even as new regulations are written. Most important is to remember that regulations are a means to an end. Writing a regulation and thinking that an objective has been achieved is the wrong way to go about it. Regulations are a means to an end. We shouldn't lose sight of that. And that end is ensuring orderly conduct in the regulated universe. It's useful to remember that if India is to progress, if the Indian economy is to progress, persons that conduct business, no matter what the sector, need to know what the regulations are, need to have adequate clarity, need to be reminded on a continuing basis that any transgression will be seriously viewed, and also need to be encouraged to stay within the remit of regulations and to act appropriately. Good conduct has to be incentivized, bad conduct has to be put down ruthlessly. Then and then alone will we have a regulated universe that makes sense, that contributes to progress, and at the end of the day makes everyone happy. Let's, on the occasion of Ganesh Chaturthi, rededicate ourselves to the cause of making regulations enablers rather than obstacles. Thank you very much.